Let's begin tonight with something a little darker. A trip to the young capital of a new nation, right when it faced its first great terror. You might picture the founding fathers talking about freedom in the fine halls of Philadelphia, but for regular people, life in the summer of 1793 was less about the joy of a new country and more about how to make it through the night. Tonight, you are not George Washington. You are just you, thrown onto the cobblestone streets with no warning. An unseen enemy carried in the buzz of a mosquito waits around every corner. So before you get comfortable, please like the video and subscribe if you truly enjoy this content. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see who joins us from around the world. Now lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background sound, and let's start tonight's journey together. The summer of 1793 found Philadelphia in a state of hot excitement, and it was just the weather. A wet, sticky heat. A thick, bad air rose from the Delaware River. It stuck to the red bricks of the houses, refusing to leave even in the deep dark of night. The air was thick and heavy, like a blanket you could not escape. But the real excitement was one of big dreams and trying new things. Philadelphia was no normal city. It was at that moment the temporary capital of a nation that still smelled of gunpowder and fresh ink. It was the beating heart of the United States of America. On its cobblestone streets, often covered in dust and worse, walked the builders of this new republic. You could see the tall, strong figure of George Washington, his face already a mask of serious calm, walking to the president's house on Market Street, or Thomas Jefferson, all and thin, his mind always full of ideas about freedom and farming, arguing loudly with the lively, practical Alexander Hamilton about national debt and the future of government power. James Madison, more quiet, but just as important, moved through the halls of Congress Hall, making the deals that would shape the nation's laws. Philadelphia was the testing ground, the place where big ideas from the Enlightenment were hammered into the hard, often uncomfortable reality of ruling, with almost 50,000 people living there. It was the biggest and most diverse city in the country, a center for trade, science, and thought. Benjamin Franklin's Library Company, the American Philosophical Society. They were lights of knowledge all and just starting to know itself. But under this surface of smart thinking and political power, the city hid a much darker, dirtier secret. Its basic systems simply had not grown as fast as the city did. Philadelphia was a city that smelled bad. And it was not a light smell. It was a powerful, ever-present smell of rot. The main source was the water, or the lack of good management. Most people got their water from shared wells, dug dangerously close to backyard toilet pits. Every home had its privy in the back, a simple hole in the ground. Once full, it was oft uncovered with a thin layer of dirt, before another was dug right next to it. Poison from thousands of these pits seeped slowly into the ground, polluting the very water people drank. The streets were the dumping grounds. Butchers threw animal guts and blood right into open gutters, which were just ditches by the street. Homes threw their kitchen waste. Fish heads, vegetable peels, bones out the door. Horses, the main way to get around, left a constant trail of manure that cooked in the August sun. The tanneries, with their awful chemical smell, poured their dirty waste into nearby streams. The most famous of these was Dock Creek. Once a clear flowing stream, by 1793, it was a still rotten swamp, a greenish-black breeding place that cut through the heart of the city's most crowded areas, before slowly emptying into the Delaware. Then there was the port. Philadelphia's moneymaker was also its weakest point. The docks along the Delaware were packed with ships from across the Atlantic world. Masts stood against the sky like a forest without leaves. The salt air mixed with the smell of tar, strange spices, and most of all still dirty ship water. Ships emptied their sewage and waste right into the river, just feet from where children played and fishermen cast nets. On the banks piles of goods sat under the sun. A load of coffee from the West Indies that got wet on the trip was thrown onto Bull Wharf where it began to rot, letting out a sour, strong smell that locals later blamed for the coming disaster. They were not totally wrong to point to the rot as a problem, but their science was not complete. They looked for the cause in the smell in the bad air. They did not know the real enemy was much smaller, silent, and about to arrive by ship. A city with its many puddles of still water, its rain barrels for collecting water, its ditches and its swampy creek, was not just a busy big city. It was a perfect home ready for the arrival of a very specific kind of traveler. And into that home in the choking heat of late July and early August 1793 the ships came. They were not the usual trade ships full of rum, sugar, or cloth. These ships carried a human load. Desperate and scared, they were refugee ships running from hell. They were running from the French colony of Saint-Domingue, what we know today as Haiti. At its peak, Saint-Domingue had been the richest colony in the world, a money machine for France built on a slavery system of almost unbelievable cruelty. But in 1791, that machine broke. Inspired by the echoes of the French Revolution, the slaves of Saint-Domingue, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, rose up in a huge and bloody revolt. What followed was a chaotic, many-sided fight, involving rebel slaves, free men of color, white planters, and troops from France, Spain, and Britain. By the summer of 1793, the city of Cap Français, the jewel of the colony's crown, was in flames. Fighting between rival groups had grown into all-out violence. Plantation owners, their families, and other white colonists who had just escaped death crowded the port, begging for a place on any ship that could take them away. One of those ships was the Maria brig that docked in Philadelphia in late July. On board were French colonists and some of their household slaves, all packed together in terrible conditions. Another was the Sans Souci, which arrived with more refugees. In all, about 2,000 people from Saint-Domingue flooded into Philadelphia during those weeks, bringing with them stories of horror and very few things. The city, with its liking for the French revolutionary cause, welcomed them. Help groups were organized, money was raised. The people of Philadelphia looked at the refugees and felt a mix of pity and a touch of pride for their own, so far more orderly revolution. But the refugees did not travel alone. On their ships, in the damp dark of the holds, in the barrels of drinking water kept on deck for the trip, traveled another passenger, a tiny stowaway, fragile but very tough. It was not a bacteria, it was not a virus that traveled from person to person through the air. It was the carrier of the vehicle. It was the Aedes aegypti mosquito. This particular mosquito is a creature of fine taste. Unlike others of its kind, it strongly prefers human blood to that of other animals. It is sneaky, often biting ankles and elbows, going unnoticed, and it does not need a big swamp to make more. Any small collection of clean, still water is enough. A dish under a flower pot, an old tire, a clogged gutter, or importantly a water barrel on the deck of a ship. The eggs of the Aedes aegypti are very strong. They can survive 4 months in a dry state, waiting patiently for moisture to wake them up. The ships running from Cap Français were unknowingly floating nurseries, female mosquitoes having already fed on the blood of people sick with yellow fever in the Caribbean, where the disease was common, laid their eggs on the inner walls of the water barrels. During the 2-week trip to Philadelphia, those eggs hatched. The larvae wriggled in the water, grew into pupae, and finally came out as adults ready to fly, feed, and make more. As soon as the ship docked, when the refugees stepped onto the Philadelphia dock, tired and traumatized, an invisible cloud of infected mosquitoes stepped off with them. They flew silently into the city, a new and promising hunting ground, and they found the perfect home that waited for them. The streets of Philadelphia, with rain barrels in every backyard to collect water, a practice suggested by Dr. Benjamin Rush himself, to have water ready in case of fire, with its ditches full of still rainwater, its flooded cellars, and thousands of forgotten containers, or an open feast for making more mosquitoes. The local population of Aedes aegypti mosquito, which already lived in the city, but had not yet been exposed to the virus on a large scale, joined the feast. A healthy mosquito but a sick refugee. The mosquito became infected, and then that infected mosquito bit a healthy Philadelphian. The cycle had begun. The biological fuse carried across the ocean in water barrels had reached the powder keg of Philadelphia, and the city, deep in its political toxin, its summer heat, had not the smallest idea what was about to happen. It all began as great disasters often do, quietly, almost unseen. A few separate cases in the areas near the river, the poorest, the dirtiest, the most crowded. In early August, a young Irishman named Peter Austin, who lived in a boarding house on Water Street, fell ill. He died on August 7. A few days later, a French woman staying in the same house also got sick and died, then another person staying there. Local doctors like Dr. James Hutchinson were old and were confused. The signs were scary and above all strange. They did not look like the usual summer fever common in Philadelphia. The sickness started normal enough. A sudden high fever, chills, a terrible headache that felt like it would split the skull, and a back pain so strong patients said it felt like bones breaking. The eyes would redden, the face would flush. So far it could have been a bad flu or any other summer fever. But after 3 or 4 days of this pain, something odd would happen. The fever would break, the headache would ease. The patient would feel weak, tired, but clearly better. A false dawn, a cruel pause that gave a fleeting hope to the families and the sick themselves. They thought the worst was over, that they were getting better. This quiet time lasted barely a day, sometimes only a few hours, and then the sickness would return with double force. This was the second stage, the toxic phase. The fever would spike again, but this time the patient's body began to give up. The liver started to fail, unable to process bilirubin, a waste product of red blood cells. The patient's skin and the whites of their eyes would start to take on a worrying yellow color. It was this yellowing that gave the disease its common and descriptive name, the yellow fever. But the yellowing, most scary to see, was only the start. The kidneys would also start to fail, and then the bleeding would begin. Blood seeped from the gums, from the nose, sometimes even from the eyes and ears. Dark bruises would appear under the skin for no clear reason. And then came the final and most feared sign, the sure warning of death. The patient would start to feel sick, to vomit violently, their whole body shaking with the effort, and they would throw up. But what came out was not food. It was a dark, thick, almost black liquid full of blood, partly digested by stomach acid. It looked like coffee grounds. The doctors called it the black vomit. Once a patient reached this stage, the end was almost certain. Death would come from shock, from many organ failure, from major internal bleeding. The whole process, from the first chill to the last breath, rarely lasted more than a week. It was a fast, brutal end to the doctors of 1793, a completely confusing disease. Dr. Benjamin Rush, perhaps the most famous and respected doctor in America, was one of the first to realize the city faced something new and awful. On August 19, he was called to help a merchant's daughter. He watched her suffer and die with all the classic signs. That same day, he helped another patient with the same condition. Rush, a man of huge energy and even greater self-belief, checked his medical books, used his vast experience. He realized what he saw matched the descriptions of the yellow fever that had destroyed the West Indies in the past. He realized the plague was in Philadelphia. He began to sound the alarm. He wrote to the newspapers, warning the people. But his diagnosis was met with doubt and denial. Other important doctors like Dr. Adam Kuhn disagreed. They argued it was just the usual summer fever, maybe a bit worse than normal because of the heat. On the dirty condition, the medical community was split. Was it a sickness brought from outside by the ships, from St. Domingue, as Rush said? Or was it a local illness coming from the bad air, of the rot on the docks, as others thought? This argument was not just academic, it had huge real effects. If the disease was brought from outside and spread person to person, the answer was quarantine, isolate the sick, close the port. But if it was made locally by the bad air, then quarantine was useless. The answer in that case would be to clean the city, and for those who could afford it, to run to a place with cleaner air. While the doctors argued, the death count began to rise quickly. From a few cases in early August it grew to 10, then 20 deaths a day. The church bells, which usually rang to tell of each death, began to ring with such a sad and steady pace that the leaders finally asked them to stop, for fear the constant sound would cause even greater panic. The first panic was not an explosion, but a growing feeling of worry. People began to notice more funeral processions in the streets. They began to hear stories of whole families wiped out in a few days. They began to distrust their neighbors, the air they breathed, the fruit they bought at the market. Those who could, the rich, began to pack their bags quietly. Carriages full of trunks and furniture began to leave the city in the dark of night, heading for the countryside, to Germantown, to anywhere away from the smell and the sickness. But for most people in Philadelphia, the workers, the dock hands, the poor, the growing community of free African Americans, running was not an option. They were trapped in a city that was fast becoming a death trap, facing an unseen enemy that defied all the medical science of their time. They did not know the real killer was not in the air, but in the almost silent buzz of a mosquito landing on their ankle as they slept. The summer in the capital had only just begun to show its true terrible face. In the middle of this storm of guesswork and panic stood a figure of almost legendary status in late 1700s Philadelphia, a man whose name meant the American Enlightenment, a mind as powerful as his love for his country. His name was Dr. Benjamin Rush. Rush was not just a doctor, he was a force of nature, a whole institution by himself, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, treasurer of the U.S. Mint, a social reformer, an abolitionist, and maybe the most famous doctor in the whole young nation. His reputation was as solid as the bricks of Independence Hall, where he had helped shape the destiny of a country. When he spoke, people listened, and in the choking August of 1793, everyone waited desperately for him to speak. On August 25, with the city buzzing with fear and rumors spreading faster than the disease itself, Rush called an emergency meeting of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. This was no simple doctors' club. Founded in 1787, the college was the nation's top medical authority, an elite group made of the city's most respected and learned doctors. They gathered at their headquarters, a place of serious debate and scientific discussion, to face an invisible enemy that laughed at their shared understanding of medicine. The feeling in the room must have been tense, heavy with the weight of duty. Every man there knew the lives of their fellow citizens depended on their wisdom. The first debate focused on the most basic question: where did this plague come from? The attention of most turned, almost right away, to the busy Arch Street wharf. Weeks earlier, a load of coffee had arrived from the island of St. Domingue, fleeing the burning revolution there. Some of that coffee had been left to rot on the wharf under the relentless August sun. The smell was famous, a rotten and offensive bad air that stuck to the air so thick that nearby people complained they could taste it. For the doctors of the 1700s, taught in the old Greek theories, this was an almost perfect culprit, a foul and strong smell coming from rotting matter, which matched the center of the outbreak. The logic seemed unshakable. Dr. Isaac Cuff, one of the members, even did a kind of check on the pile of coffee, saying its sharp smell was without doubt the source of the evil fumes now troubling the city. Based on this idea, the College of Physicians gave its first set of public advice. It was a list of sensible steps filtered through the science of the time. They told people to clean the streets and gutters, a smart move no matter the cause. They suggested avoiding contact with the sick, a nod to the chance of spreading, though the bad air idea was stronger. They said to carry vinegar or camphor on handkerchief to clean the air you breathed while walking down the street, in a move that seems odd today, but was then seen as a modern public health step. They asked for cannons to be fired in the streets. The thought was the explosions and gunpowder smoke would break up and clean the still poisonous air. They also asked with feeling that the ringing of church bells for funerals be done with care, not to stop death, but to keep the constant sound of sadness from pushing the living people into a frozen despair. The college's response was a perfect picture of the medical crossroad where they stood. It was a common logical try to use the known science in an overwhelming crisis. Yet their advice, though well meant, was like trying to stop a forest fire with a teacup. The plague did not care about vinegar, and was not scared by the roar of a cannon. The enemy was far more clever, and its way of attack was at the heart of a debate that split not just the doctors of Philadelphia, but the whole Western medical world. It was a battle of ideas with life and death results, a thinking war fought in hospital halls and at the bedsides of the sick. The big question over everything was, did the disease float in the air, or did it jump from person to person? It was the basic fight between bad air and spreading contact. The bad air theory was old, elegant, and very easy to believe. Its name comes from the Greek word for pollution, and its line goes back to the start of Western medicine. The main idea was simple. Epidemic diseases, especially fevers, were not caused by something that passed between people, but came from the environment itself. They were fumes or poisonous vapors that came from rotting matter, from still water, from the very earth itself. In certain seasons the air, especially the night air, could become corrupted and carry this invisible sickness to anyone who breathed it. Smell was the main sign of danger. A bad smell, whether from a swampy slaughterhouse or a pile of rotting coffee, was the physical sign of the disease. This theory had great explaining power for the 1700s second's mind. It explained why epidemics often came in the warm wet months of summer and fall, when rot was fastest and smells were strongest. It explained why poorer crowded areas with their bad sanitation were often hit hardest. It was not because people were close together, the bad air believers argued, but because the pile of dirt and rot made a more deadly air. For a believer like Dr. Rush, yellow fever was not something you caught in the modern sense. It was an environmental condition. Philadelphia was not infecting itself, it was being poisoned by its own dirty air. The results of this belief were deep. If the air was the enemy, then the answer was to clean it. Hence the advice to clean the streets, to burn it on street corners, to make a strong smoke thought to be a cleaner, and to fire cannons to stir the air. Quarantining people from this view was mostly useless. You could isolate a man, but you could not isolate him from the air he breathed. The disease by this logic could start on its own in anyone who breathed the right bad air at the wrong time. In the other corner of the thinking ring stood the theory of spreading contact. This idea, while also old, felt more direct and too many more frightening. It said the disease was caused by a kind of seed or agent that passed from a sick person to a healthy one, either by direct touch, by touching contaminated objects, or even through the breath of the sick at close range. Spreading contact believers saw the disease not as an environmental cloud, but as a chain of passing, a trail that led from one body to the next. The proof seemed on their side. In many cases it was clear that diseases like smallpox or measles spread inside families and among close contact. Sailors arriving on ships from sick ports often brought the disease, suggesting it was not the air of the new port to blame, but something the sailors themselves carried in their bodies or on their things. The theory of spreading contact led to a totally different set of public health actions. If the disease lived in people and their things, then the defense was separation. Quarantine became the main tool, isolating the sick, stopping ships from infected areas from docking, and setting up clean lines around sick cities. It was a logic of siege where the healthy community walled itself off from the threat of the infected bodies. This theory fed social fear in a far more personal way than bad air. Bad air was an unseen, everywhere enemy. Spreading contact turned your neighbor, your friend, even your own sick child, into a possible source of death. It made the act of caring for a loved one an act of brave self-sacrifice. In Philadelphia in 1793, this thinking battle was no simple school exercise. It played out in the streets with terrible results. The first advice from the College of Physicians was an uneasy mix of both theories: clean the streets, bad air, but avoid the sick spreading contact. This belief confusion left the average person lost. Should they fear the air or their neighbors? Should they open their windows to air out their homes, or seal them to keep out the night bad air? Most of Philadelphia's doctors, including the powerful Dr. Rush, leaned firmly toward the bad air theory. They believed the fever was from the local area, born from the rot of their own city, and that it was neither brought from outside nor very contagious from person to person. This belief held with the best of intentions, and based on the most advanced science of its time, would have tragic results. It led to a focus on cleaning the environment, while underestimating how easily the disease could spread in a tight city setting. And most importantly, this belief in a local, non-spreading origin freed Benjamin Rush to focus not on prevention through isolation, but on the search for a cure. A radical, aggressive, and, in his own words, heroic cure. A cure that would define the epidemic as much as the disease itself. As August turned into an ever hotter and deadlier September, Dr. Rush's faith in simple clean-up steps began to fall apart. Cleaning the streets and firing cannons were not working. The death line was not flattening. It was shooting up like a rocket. The death carts, once an occasional sight, now rattled over the cobblestone streets day and night, the drivers calling out their grim message: "Bring out your dead." Rush, working without rest, visiting dozens of patients a day, was overcome by a sense of helplessness. His normal treatments, rest soups, Peruvian bark wine, a source of quinine, were useless against the fever's anger. He watched his patients go through the terrible stages: the first chills, the burning fever, the lying time of calm, and then the fever's return with yellowing bleeding, and the feared black vomit. They died in pain, and he, the most famous doctor in America, could do nothing to stop it. In his desperation, Rush dug into his big library, frantically searching through old medical texts for any clue, any forgotten story of a similar epidemic that might offer an answer. It was then he found a dusty paper written 50 years earlier in 1741 by a Dr. John Mitchell of Virginia. The paper described an outbreak of yellow fever in that colony, and detailed a treatment Mitchell said he used with some success. Mitchell's approach was anything but gentle. It was based on the idea that the fever was a violent tension in the blood system, and that the body was filled with rotten bile fluids in the stomach and gut. To fight this, Mitch argued for a drastic step: first, to violently clean the digestive system, and second, to drain blood to ease the pressure. For Rush, reading this paper was like a message from heaven. It was the answer he had been looking for. The disease was an overwhelming force, and it could only be beaten with an equally overwhelming force. Gentleness had failed. It was time for war. He took and changed Mitchell's plan, making it his own system of care, a system that would go down in medical history under the name heroic medicine. His cure was built onto twin pillars of body emptying, two harsh methods made to force the disease from the patient's body by any means needed: huge cleans and heavy bloodletting. The first pillar, the cleanse, was given through a strong mix of two substances. The first was yellowfever, plant-based cleanser that caused cramps, but the true star of the mix was calomel or mercury chloride. Calomel was a heavy white powdered cleanser of almost unbelievable force. Rush's normal dose, which would soon become famously known as the 10 and 10, had 10 grains of calomel mixed with 10 grains of yellowfever. To put this in view, a medical dose of calomel in later times rarely went over a single grain. Rush was giving 10 times that amount, often repeated many times a day. The effect was catastrophic. It caused heavy saliva and explosive watery diarrhea, emptying the guts with rushing force. Rush believed this process was removing the bile and poison fluids that, in his view, caused the disease. What he was really doing was causing serious lack of water, an electrolyte imbalance in patients already weak from fever, and an inability to keep fluids. More, he was giving huge doses of mercury and own poison. Patients who survived the treatment often suffered the long-term effects of mercury poisoning: loss of teeth and hair, nerve damage and sores in the mouth and gums. But in the heat of battle, Rush saw the body's violent reaction, not as a harmful side effect, but as proof the cure was working. The violence of the cleanse was the measure of its success. The second pillar of his therapy was even more dramatic: bloodletting or phlebotomy. The practice of bleeding patients was one of the oldest and most honored traditions in medicine. It was based on the fluid theory that health depended on a perfect balance among the four body fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Fever, by this theory, was often the result of a fullness, an excess of blood, which caused swelling and tension in the blood vessels. The logical answer was simple: remove the extra blood. Armed with a lancet, a small sharp blade, often kept in a fine ivory or tortoiseshell case, Rush would open a vein, usually in the patient's arm, and drain the blood into a clay or pewter bowl. But Rush did not practice bloodletting in moderation. He took it to no extremes. While normal practice might involve taking a few ounces of blood, Rush argued for bleeding to the very edge of passing out. He believed the amount of blood taken should match the violence of the disease. He told his helpers and followers to bleed patients until they almost fainted, a state called syncope. Believing this loss of pulse showed the artery tension was beaten. The records are chilling. Rush boasted of taking as much as 80 ounces, 5 pints, or roughly 80% of an adult's total blood supply, from a single patient over several days. He took 4/5 of a man's life force to save him. The bowls filled with dark, thick blood, which Rush saw as proof of its rotten nature. In truth, faint blood is naturally darker and it thickens as the body becomes dangerously dry. He was draining the life and oxygen from his patients, weakening their hearts and pushing them toward shock, all in the name of healing. This double approach of cleansing and bleeding became Dr. Rush's gospel. He used it with the fire of a crusader. He raced through the city from house to house, barely sleeping, his clothes often stained with the blood and other fluids of his patients. He taught his method to his students and to anyone who would listen. He published papers and letters in the newspapers, saying his cure worked and giving clear steps so people could use it on themselves and their families. In a city left without its doctors, many having run, fallen ill, or died, Rush's system gave something people desperately wanted: a plan. It was a clear, decisive, and, above all, heroic plan. It gave people the sense they were actively fighting the disease, not just waiting to die from it. Of course, not everyone in the medical world was convinced. A good number of doctors, especially those with French training, like Jean Evzay, who worked at the Bush Hill Hospital, were horrified by Rush's methods. Devzai and his friends argued for a much gentler, almost modern approach: rest fresh air liquids like lemonade and port wine, and cool baths to lower the fever. It was supportive care made to help the patient's body fight the disease on its own. The split between these two sides was bitter, and was fought in the public press. Rush's followers called him a savior, the only doctor brave enough to take the strong steps needed. His critics, like the publisher William Cobbett, nicknamed him Prince of Bleeders and accused him of killing his patients with his poison cures and extreme bleeding. But in the Philadelphia of 1793, the voice of Benjamin Rush, powered by his huge fame and superhuman energy, drowned out all others. His heroic cure became the normal treatment. Scared citizens at the first sign of fever gave themselves or their loved ones mercury cleanses in near-fatal bloodletting. It is impossible to know how many people died from the treatment, rather than the disease. But it is clear Rush's heroic cure added a new layer of terror and pain to a city already on its knees. Dr. Rush, in his wish to beat the plague, had himself become a kind of plague. A man sure he was saving Philadelphia a while with the best intentions, and the worst medicine he helped to empty it. The fight for the city's life was fought, not only against an invisible virus, but also against the dangerous ideas of its most famous doctor. By the end of August 1793, the air in Philadelphia, already thick with the wet heat of late summer, had grown heavy, with something else, a real bad air of fear. Talks in taverns and markets no longer were about politics or grain prices, but had shrunk to feverish whispers about who was the latest to fall. The rattle of carts over cobblestones, normally a sign of business and life, began to take on a new and evil meaning. Some no longer carried goods but whole families, their most prized things tied down with rope, running from the city as if from an attacking army, because in a way they were. The enemy was unseen, silent, and completely merciless. The leaving did not start as a flood but as a steady trickle. First were the richest those with country homes in Germantown, or farms along the Schuylkill River. For them it was a simple matter of starting the fall holidays early, a wise retreat from the city as unhealthy air. But as the daily death count climbed from 12 to 20, then to 40, the trickle became a stream and then a rush. Panic is a spread of its own, and it spread faster than the fever itself. Newspapers like Andrew Brown's Federal Gazette at first tried to keep calm, printing the reassuring reports of the College of Physicians, but the death notices did not lie. People trusted the proof of the funeral carts more than editors' words, and the carts were getting ever busier. The leaving of regular people was one thing, the breaking apart of the government was another. Philadelphia was not just the biggest and most diverse city in the United States, it was its capital, the center of its newborn and fragile Republican experiment. Here the president lived, Congress met in Congress Hall, and the departments of State, War, and Treasury did the nation's work. The presence of the federal government was the city's anchor, a symbol of order and stability, and that anchor was about to come loose. George Washington, the president, watched the growing crisis from the president's house on High Street, now Market Street. He was a man of order and discipline, not quick to panic. He had planned, as he did every year, to go to his beloved Mount Vernon in early fall. The epidemic just made that plan, leaving seem less a vacation and more a smart retreat. On September 10, with the death toll nearing 100 in a single day, the president felt he had done his duty to stay as a sign of calm. The president's group, with George and Martha Washington, their servants and their personal things, left the city. His carriage, rolling south over the dusty Pennsylvania roads, was a clear symbol. The father of the nation had left his children in their darkest hour. It was not an act of fear, but of practicality. The survival of the president was the survival of the presidency itself. But for those left behind, seeing the windows of the president's house boarded up, it felt like abandonment. Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, was a man of the Enlightenment, an amateur scientist interested in weather, plants, and medicine. At first he was doubtful of the fear. He noted in his letters that fall fevers were common in Philadelphia, but as his own neighbors began to die, and the bells of Christ Church rang without stopping, his logic gave way to a sharp instinct for survival. He and his big rival Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, showed the two sides of Washington's government. Jefferson, the farm aristocrat from Virginia; Hamilton, the ambitious moneyman from New York. Even in the middle of a plague, their political fight burned. They watched each other, each one maybe waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake, whether political or real. Hamilton, ever defiant and maybe a little proud, decided to stay. He believed to run would be to give up his duty. It was a choice that almost cost him his life. In early September, both he and his wife, Eliza, fell ill. The signs were clear: the high fever, the awful pains, the feared black vomit. While Dr. Benjamin Rush searched the city with his lancets and his mercury cleanses, Hamilton chose a different treatment. He trusted his friend, Dr. Edward Stevens, who had grown up with him in the West Indies. Stevens suggested a gentler method: cold baths, rest, and big doses of chinchona bark, the source of quinine. mixed with wine. By miracle, both Alexander and Eliza Hamilton got better. Their survival was news, and for a short time, the West Indian treatment became the popular therapy, a ray of hope in the dark. But once better, Hamilton did not test chance again. He packed his family and went to the area of Albany, New York, to get better. The money system of the nation, which he ran with an iron hand, stopped. Jefferson, seeing his enemy fall, waited no longer. On September 17, after making sure the most urgent work of the State Department was in order, he headed south, toward the clean, safe air of Monticello. In his letters, he described a nightmare city, empty streets, houses marked with a chalk cross showing sickness. The strange silence broken only by the distant cry of a crazy person, or the lonely rattle of a cart collecting the dead. The government of the United States had disappeared. The Attorney General Edmund Randolph also ran. Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, was already out of the city. Congress, which was due to meet again in the fall, scattered. Lawmakers, hearing of the plague, simply refused to travel to Philadelphia. There was talk of calling an emergency meeting in Germantown or elsewhere, but the planning was impossible. The nation's capital was for all purposes closed. By the end of September, nearly 20,000 people, almost half of Philadelphia's population, had run. Those who stayed were those who could not afford to leave, those who were too sick to travel, or those who, out of a sense of duty or a strange acceptance, chose to stay and face the horror. The city became an empty shell, a city of the dead ruled by fear and disease. Businesses were closed. The port, normally full of ships and sailors, was strangely quiet. Anchored ships rotted at their docks. Nearby cities like Baltimore and New York set up quarantines and armed guards on the roads, treating any refugee from Philadelphia as an outcast, a possible carrier of death. The biggest city in North America had become an island, cut off from the world and left to its fate by its own leaders. The great Republican experiment seemed to be failing its first real test. The government had saved itself, but it had left its capital to rot from inside. And in the empty space left by power and authority, on the empty streets where order was breaking, a community, one that most of white Philadelphia barely saw as part of its city, was about to step forward in the empty space of power and panic as the carriages of the rich kicked up dust on the roads out of Philadelphia. A group of men gathered in a small schoolhouse. They were not statesmen or wealthy traders. They were the leaders of the Free African Society of Philadelphia, and they faced a choice of huge size. The society, started in 1787 by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, was far more than a simple church, was social courage, was social club. It was the beating heart of the city's free black community, a safety net, a community bank, and a center for political and spiritual organization all in one. Allen, a former slave from Delaware who had bought his own freedom, was a Methodist preacher of great speaking skill and strong character. Jones, also born into slavery, had worked hard for years to buy his wife's freedom and then his own, becoming a respected leader. Together they showed the toughness and hope of Philadelphia's more than 2,000 free black residents. The reason their help was asked was based on a tragic and deadly piece of medical wrong information. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the city's most famous medical figure, and a man who for all his conflicts was a true abolitionist, had made an observation. During the first days of the epidemic, he seemed to notice that very few of the patients were of African descent. From this limited story observation, he jumped to a far-reaching conclusion, one he published with all the weight of his position. He said that black people had a natural protection, or at least a strong resistance to yellow fever. The theory, though completely wrong, had a surface of logic to the 1700s mind. It was widely thought that diseases were tied to climate and the nature of peoples. Since yellow fever was common in parts of Africa and the Caribbean, it seemed possible that people of African descent had developed an inborn shield. Mayor Matthew Clarkson, a good man, overwhelmed trying to keep some kind of order in his dying city, held on to Rush's theory like a lifeline. With most of the white nurses and grave diggers dead, sick, or run, the city desperately needed anyone to take over the most dangerous and needed jobs. Clarkson made a formal ask to the Free African Society, requesting its members to serve as nurses for the sick and to handle the burial of the dead. The request put Allen and Jones in an incredibly hard position. On one hand, the plea was based on a racist idea, the thought that their bodies were basically different and better suited to risky work. On the other, it gave an ever-before-seen chance. In a nation where their humanity was constantly questioned and their rights were shaky, this was a chance to show in the most real way possible their civic worth, their Christianity, and their shared humanity. They could be the saviors of the very city that in normal times treated them with scorn and doubt. After deep thought and prayer, Allen and Jones made their choice. They would accept the mayor's call. They gathered the members of their community and explained the situation. The response was huge. Men and women volunteered, believing as the city's best doctors had told them that they were safe. They became the front line of defense for a city under attack. Their work was more than brave, it was the very system that stopped Philadelphia's total collapse. Members of the Free African Society went into the homes of the sick, both black and white. They did what scared family members no longer dared to do. They held the heads of the dying, gave them water, changed their dirty sheets, and listened to their last crazy word. They did these acts of close care for strangers, knowing each room held an almost certain death for their patients. When death inevitably came, their work continued. The process of handling the bodies was especially awful and dangerous. The volunteers, led by men like Absalom Jones, went house to house, collecting the bodies that had often lain for days left by their families. They built simple coffins and carried the dead to the city's burial ground, today's Washington Square. There in the common land, set aside for the poor and strangers, they dug mass graves. There was no time for single ceremonies. The bodies were lowered, sometimes dozens at a time, and covered with dirt. Jones in particular became known for his tireless work, personally driving the death cart through the silent streets. His figure a grim but reassuring presence in the city's nightmare. The work was tiring physically and emotionally, but the true tragedy had yet to show itself. By mid-September, the comforting live black protection began to fall apart. Members of the African American community began to fall sick, and they began to die. The same fever, the same terrible signs. Dr. Rush had been catastrophically wrong. His theory, built on flawed observation and the biases of the age, proved to be a death sentence. Allen and Jones watched their friends, their neighbors, the brave volunteers they had asked, get the very plague they were fighting. Richard Allen himself got the disease. He took Rush's brutal treatments of bloodletting and against all odds lived, though weakened. Faced with this horrific truth, they could have stopped. They could have said rightly that they had been tricked, sent on a suicide job under false ideas. No one would have blamed them, but they did not. Despite the now known danger, despite the betrayal of medical science, Allen Jones and the community of the Free African Society continued their work. Their reason was no longer a belief in their own safety, but a deepened, amazing sense of duty and human care. They kept nursing the sick, white and black alike. They kept burying the dead. Their bravery, already amazing, became something almost superhuman. They were looking death in the face each day, knowing they had no special shield, and still they did not look away. In all, an estimated 240 of Philadelphia's black residents died from the fever, a death rate about the same as the white population. Their sacrifice was huge, and their reward, when the epidemic faded, was slander. The publisher Matthew Carey, in his popular story of the plague, included claims that some black nurses had robbed the homes of their patients and charged very high prices for their services. While there may have been separate cases of taking a chance, as there were among whites, the charge stained the shared sacrifice of the whole community. In reply, Richard, Ellen, and Absalom Jones wrote their own story, a paper titled A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia. In it, they carefully recorded their work, argued Carey's claims with facts, and told the stories of their own people dying while doing their duty. It was one of the first papers published by African-American writers in the United States, a powerful act of self-defense, and a taking back of their place on the city's history. They were asked for bravery based on a lie had saved the city, but even then they had to fight to have their story told fairly. At the heart of Philadelphia, breaking the city's most pushed-aside community had proven to be its strongest support, while the members of the Free African Society fought their brave, organized battle against the disease. The city's social web around them was coming apart thread by thread. The epidemic did not just attack bodies, it ate away at the very ties that held society together: family, trust, community, and law. Fear, a universal asset, dissolved the most sacred duties and set custom, showing the rock or of individual survival instinct. The first and most shocking break happened inside the home, the wholly safe place of 1700 seconds life. Ties of blood thought to be unbreakable shattered with terrifying ease. When the fever entered a house, it often did not take a single victim, but moved through a family like a fire. At first, healthy family would nurse the sick, but as they saw the certainty of death and the scary spreading, family and marriage love often gave way to a basic terror. The stories that came from the city were of an almost biblical emptiness. Husbands leaving their sick wives on their beds, sometimes even dragging them into the street to die alone so as not to dirty the house. Parents locking the door to a sick child's room, passing food underneath until silence said the end had come. Adult children running from the homes of their old parents, leaving them to their fate. One doctor told the story of a young Frenchman who had come to the city and stayed with a family. When he fell ill, the family who had welcomed him warmly just put him out of the house and left him in the garden to die. He was found there by a caring neighbor, but it was too late. These were not acts of planned evil, but of total panic. People believed the very breath of the sick, the simple touch of their sheets, was a death sentence. The home meant to be a safe place became a death trap, and trust, the base of any family relationship, vanished into the feverish air. The most heartbreaking result of this family break was the sudden appearance of a group of orphans. Children, some just babies, were suddenly alone in the world. Their parents had died, or one had died and the other had run. They were seen walking the empty streets, hungry, dirty, and confused. Some sat on the steps of their now empty houses, waiting for a return that would never come. Neighbors, eaten by their own fear, often dared not to take them in. The city orphanage was quickly overrun, and conditions there were a little better than on the streets. Mayor Clarkson and his group of volunteers did what they could. They changed William Hamilton's estate on the city edge, called Bush Hill, into an emergency hospital. But Bush Hill quickly got a terrifying name. At first it was badly run, a chaotic and dirty place where people were sent to die, though later, under the great management of French-American businessman Stephen Girard and Cooper Peter Hell, it became a model hospital. Its name stays linked with death. For many children, being sent to Bush Hill was just a step before being buried in the potter's field. The sight of small children alone and helpless, a scene almost unknown in the America of the time, was one of the deepest scars the plague left on the city's mind. With the breaking of the family and the leaving of children, it is no surprise public also fell apart. Crime, which always waits on the edges of society, found good ground. In the chaos, the homes of those who had run were perfect targets, with their owners away, and the city watchmen sick, dead, or run themselves. The houses were easy prey for looters. They would break in, taking not just silver and valuables, but also needs: blankets, clothes, food, and alcohol. Some thieves were criminals taking a chance. Others were simply desperate people who had lost their jobs and had no other way to feed their families. The line between the two became blurred. Even the dead and dying were not safe. There were reports of bad nurses, often alcoholics hired from taverns, who would rob their patients on their deathbeds, pulling rings from their fingers and money from under the mattress. Funeral carts were sometimes stopped in the body stripped of any valuable clothing or shoes. It was a total disrespect of human dignity, a sign that the most basic rules of civilization had been paused. The city government, weakened and overrun, was powerless to stop it. Law and order had become abstract ideas in a city trying simply to survive from one day to the next. But perhaps the most sneaky part of the social break was not the crime or the leaving, but the destruction of everyday community trust. Philadelphia, like all 1700s cities, worked on a web of face-to-face meetings. People greeted each other on the street, stopped to talk, shared news at the market. The epidemic broke this web. Suddenly every fellow citizen was a possible carrier of death. People began to actively avoid one another. They would cross the street to avoid passing a friend. Talks were held at a distance, shouted across the street. The simple act of shaking hands disappeared completely. The very air became an object of doubt. People walked about with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or camphor pressed to their noses and mouths, believing strong smells cleaned the rotten air thought to cause the disease. The smell of vinegar became the perfume of the city. But these steps also served as social walls, isolating each person in their own protective bubble of scent and fear. No one could be trusted: a neighbor who coughed, a friend who looked pale, a shopkeeper who was sweating too much. All became sources of deadly doubt. The community broke into thousands of scared single units. The ideals of civic good and the common good, so dear to the Republic's founders, proved to be painfully fragile. When faced with a life-threatening danger, the community dissolved into a collection of individuals fighting for their own survival. The plague in Philadelphia was not just a medical crisis. It was a crisis of society itself, one that showed just how thin the surface of civilization was over humanity's deepest fears. As the teaching of Dr. Benjamin Rush, with his unshakable faith in the power of the lance and calomel, became the medical gospel of a scared Philadelphia, a different current of thought, gentler and more watching, flowed quietly through the city's streets. It arrived with the ships, not as an imported miracle cure, but in the minds and experience of men who had run from one hell, only to find themselves in another. They were the French refugees from the colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, escaping the cruelty and chaos of the Haitian Revolution. They landed in the port of Philadelphia during the summer of 1793, seeking safety, only to be met by a plague that was terribly familiar to them. These refugees, doctors and regular people alike, had lived with yellow fever. They knew it not as a strange and terrifying ghost, but as a seasonal beast, an unknown danger of life in the Caribbean. They had seen its patterns, its victims, and most importantly, they had seen which treatments seemed to give the sick a fighting chance, and which seemed to speed their trip to the grave. Their approach was not based on abstract theories of balanced fluids or tension in the blood system, but on raw real experience. They had seen what worked and what did not. Among these men was a figure who would offer a direct, almost against the rules, choice to Rush's angry therapy. His name was Jean Devzay. Devzay was not a Parisian sitting room doctor. He was a veteran of tropical medicine, having served as head surgeon at the military hospital in Cap Français. He had treated countless cases of what they called mal de Siam. He knew the face of the disease closely. On his arrival in Philadelphia, he found himself in a city controlled by a medical approach he thought barbaric and harmful, where Rush saw a body that needed to be violently controlled and cleaned. Devzay saw a system that needed to be supported, calmed, and helped. The French idea shown by Devzay and his friends was one of radical simplicity. It could be summed in a single word: support. Instead of attacking the patient's body in an attempt to force out the disease, they tried to boost the body's own natural defenses. They dismissed huge bloodletting to them to drain the blood from a patient already weak from fever and vomiting was madness. an act that stole from the body the very strength it needed to survive. Instead, they argued for steps that would seem to us today almost indulge in the common sense. They ordered total rest in a well-aired room. They believed in the power of fresh air to clear the bad airs, or at least to comfort the patient. They ordered fluids in plenty, cool water, light soups, fruit juices, and no to be watered down wine and spirits. They understood that lack of water was one of the great killers of the disease, and they tried to actively fight it. In place of violent cleansers of mercury and yola, which left patients broken, the French doctors used gentle laxatives, if any, simply to make sure the body did not become still. Perhaps their most important gift was the use of cinchona bark, the natural source of quinine. The bark of the Peruvian cinchona tree had long been used by Europeans to treat malaria, another fever illness. Though yellow fever and malaria are totally different diseases, the French doctors saw that the bark seemed to help reduce fevers and strengthen the patient in the recovery time. It was not a cure, but it was a supportive weapon in their tools. They would give the powdered bark, often mixed with wine, to make it easier to take and to give an extra boost. More, their focus on nursing care was key. They stressed cleanliness, changing sweat-soaked sheets, bathing the patient with cool sponges, keeping the place as clean and quiet as possible. These were practices that not only gave comfort but also provided a basic dignity in the middle of an illness that stripped its victims of all control. To cool the burning fevers, they did not turn to the lancet but to cool bath, or the use of cloth soaked in vinegar and cold water. It was an outside, non-invading treatment made to ease signs, not clean a theoretical poison. In the testing ground of panic that was Philadelphia in 1793, however, these ideas were met with doubt, if not open scorn, by the American medical world. Benjamin Rush was a powerful figure, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and thinking hero. His theories, though brutal, were systematic and given with total confidence. The French doctors, by contrast, were foreigners, refugees from a slave revolt, with strange accents and ideas that seemed dangerously passive. In an age that valued heroic action, the advice to wait and support sounded like neglect. How could rest and soup compete with the dramatic clear action of bloodletting? And so, while Rush and his followers searched the city, lancet in hand, sure that every ounce of blood taken was a win against death, the French doctors worked quietly, mostly inside their own refugee community. They treated their countrymen with their gentler methods, and though exact numbers are impossible to get from the chaos, story-proof and later studies strongly suggest their patients had a much higher survival rate. They were not curing yellow fever, no one could, but they were giving their patients the best possible chance for their own bodies to survive the virus's attack. They were in truth doing less harm, and in 1700 seconds medicine to do no harm was often the most healing act of all. The moment to influence the city's response had not yet come, but the seeds of a more human and effective choice were being planted in the middle of the panic, and soon they would find good ground in the most desperate place in all of Philadelphia, as the number of sick rose beyond the ability of any single doctor or family to handle. The city of Philadelphia faced a planning nightmare. What was to be done with the sick, especially the poor, the left, those with no one to care for them? The answer, born of need and fear, was the creation of an isolation hospital, a lazaret to where the sick could be separated from the healthy population, to live or more likely to die. The place chosen for this grim job was an estate called Bush Hill. Bush Hill was in normal times a place of beauty and privilege. It was a great stone mansion set on a hill just outside the city limits then, surrounded by gardens, trees and fresh air. It belonged to William Hamilton, a wealthy plant expert and landowner, who, like many of his class, had wisely run from the city. At the first sign of trouble, the estate, empty and isolated, seemed the perfect answer. On August 22, Mayor Matthew Clarkson and the city committee made the choice to take the property and turn it into the city yellow fever hospital. On paper, the idea was sound. In practice, it became one of the most infernal scenes of the whole epidemic. The problem was the city had a place but not a plan. There was no staff, no supplies, no system of management. The duty for Bush Hill fell to the guardians of the poor, a city group already overstretched and underfunded in the best of times. What they made in Hamilton's fine mansion was not a hospital, but a storage place for the dying. The estate's change was fast and brutal. Fine furniture was removed or pushed aside, and in its place were set up cots and mats, often so close patients could touch one another. The fine sitting rooms and sunny parlors became makeshift hospital wards, full of the smell of sickness. The earliest descriptions of Bush Hill paint a picture of almost Gothic horror. The place was run by a head nurse, a matron whose only skill for the job seemed to be her protection from the disease and her willingness to take it. The staff helping her were of the worst imaginable sort. They were poor people, drunks and small criminals, people who could find no other work and were drawn by the fairly high pay offered for such a dangerous task. These nurses and helpers were often drunk on duty, careless at best, and actively hunting at worst. It was rumored and often proved that they stole the few things of patients as they lay dying: clothes, jewelry, what little money they might have. All of it gone. Patients would arrive by cart, often simply left at the gate with no ceremony. Inside they found total chaos. There was no real separation between the newly arrived, the very ill, and the dying. A man in the early stages of the fever might be put next to another. In the middle of the black vomit, the dead often lay on their cots for hours, sometimes days, before being taken. Their presence a constant ghostly reminder of the fate that likely waited everyone else. Cleanliness was not there, the floors were covered in filth and body fluids. Patients too weak to move lay in their own dirt. Bedding, if there was any, was rarely changed. Food was scarce and of bad quality, and water was often dirty. Medical treatment was an afterthought at best. The few doctors who went inside were overrun and unable to give any real care in such disorganization. Most patients were simply left to their fate, for the disease to run its course. The name of Bush Hill spread through the city like wildfire. It became linked with death. To be sent to Bush Hill was not to be sent for treatment, it was to be sent into exile, to die out of the sight and mind of the scared people. The fear of the hospital was so strong that people would go to any length to hide their sick family. A family would rather risk infection and care for a loved one in secret, in an attic or a cellar, than give them to the horrors of Bush Hill. This reaction, while understandable, actually made the epidemic worse, as it kept sources of infection spread throughout the city rather than isolated. By early September, the situation was not acceptable. Bush Hill was not a hospital, it was a public shame and a speeder of death. Mayor Clarkson and the remaining members of the city committee knew that something drastic had to change. The city in public health crisis management had failed in the most spectacular and tragic way possible. The mansion on the hill, meant as a safe place, had become a monument to the fall of civic system. It was a place without law, without order, and above all without hope. And it was at this point of greatest desperation that two citizens, as different from one another as night and day, made a choice that would change the course of Bush Hill's history and offer an unexpected model of leadership in the middle of chaos. On September 10, 1793, Mayor Matthew Clarkson called a desperate meeting at City Hall. The city was falling apart. The federal government had run. Half the population had escaped, and those who remained lived under a cloud of fear and death. The greatest symbol of this failure was the Bush Hill Hospital, a pit of misery that shamed the city and terrified its citizens. Clarkson spoke to the small group of city leaders who had dared to show up. He laid out the plain truth of the situation at the hospital: the neglect, the chaos, the theft, the needless death. The place needed new leadership, skilled and brave management. He made an ask, almost a plea, who would take charge of Bush Hill. A heavy silence filled the room. The request was extraordinary. Clarkson was not asking for a gift of money or the signing of a paper. He was asking healthy men, family men, to willingly walk into the center of the plague to put themselves in the most dangerous place in all of North America. It was for all purposes an invitation to suicide. No one spoke. The men looked at one another, fear and doubt clear on their faces. Then one man stood up. He was not a politician or a doctor. He was a trader, a moneyman. A man known for his toughness, his oddness and his huge wealth. His name was Stephen Girard. Girard was a fascinating person, a French immigrant who had come to America with almost nothing and had built a shipping and trading empire. He was a short, stocky man, blind in one eye since childhood, which gave him a forever intense look. He had a name for being ruthless, in business stingy and difficult. He was not a man given to public shows of soft charity, and yet here he was, volunteering for a task everyone else feared. His voice with its thick French accent broke the silence. He would take charge. Girard's offer was so stunning that for a moment no one reacted. Then, inspired by his example, another man rose. He was in many ways Girard's total opposite. His name was Peter Helm. Helm was not a wealthy boss. He was a cooper, a craftsman who made barrels. He was a man of deep faith, a member of the Moravian Church, known for his goodness, his humility, and his solid work ethic. Where Girard was a worldly deist, almost an atheist by the standard of the day, pushed by a code of practicality and city order, Helm was moved by a sense of Christian duty, a call to serve the suffering. The rich, worldly French immigrant and the good, simple German craftsman. They offered to run Bush Hill together. The decision was a turning point in the epidemic. It was an act of almost unbelievable city courage. These two men, with no official duty, no experience in hospital management, were putting their lives on the line to bring order to chaos. The next day, September 12, Girard and Helm reported to Bush Hill. They wasted no time. They split the jobs by their skills. Girard, the organizing and money genius, took charge of the hospital's inside management. Helm, the practical planning man, handled the outside operations. The change was immediate and dramatic. Girard walked into the stinking, overcrowded wards with a fierce energy. He did not look away from the misery. He fired the careless matron and the whole corrupt, drunk staff on the spot. Using his own money and big influence, he began getting desperately needed supplies. He got clean cot sheets and clothes for the patients. He set up a kitchen that gave healthy food like soup and bread, instead of the small meals from before. He made a strict cleaning plan, ordering the floors be scrubbed and the walls painted white to clean them. He walked the wards every day, personally watching every detail. His presence alone a force of order and authority the hospital had never known. He was not a warm or comforting man, but his efficiency was a full of care in itself. He was saving lives not with kind words but with planning. Meanwhile, Peter Helm worked without rest on the outside. He set up an orderly system for admissions, writing down every patient who arrived. He took on the thankless but vital job of managing burials, making sure the dead were treated with a bit of dignity and buried quickly to stop further spread of disease. He watched the arrival of supplies from food and medicine to firewood for the huts. He turned the chaotic grounds of the estate into a smoothly running planning hub, the engine that kept Girard's inside changes going. Perhaps the most important choice they made was to hire a new head doctor, one whose idea matched their practical, patient-centered approach. They did not look for a follower of Benjamin Rush. Instead, they turned to the French refugee community. They chose Jean-Yves Ager, being French himself, no doubt knew of and respected the experience Yves and his friends had with the disease. They made Yves head doctor of Bush Hill, finally giving him a place to use his gentler treatments on a large scale. Under the free leaders of Girard, Helm and Yves Bush Hill began to change. The mass bleeding and cleans were replaced by rest, liquid food, and careful nursing care. Yves organized the medical staff, setting regular rounds and a standard of care. New nurses were hired, many from the free black community, recommended by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who proved to be dedicated and often protected caregivers. The hospital, while still a place of great suffering, stopped being a death trap. News of the new Bush hell spread through the city. People began to see that leaving the hospital alive was now a real possibility. The death rate, which had been shockingly high, began to steadily fall. What Gerard and Helm had done was nothing short of a miracle of crisis management. They had taken the most feared place in the city, and through the use of organization, discipline, money, and a sensible medical idea, had turned it into a working hospital. Their leadership did not just save countless lives inside the walls of Bush Hill. It also gave a powerful symbol of hope and strength to a city that was on the edge of total collapse. They showed that individual action and city cooperation could succeed where government systems had failed. The rich trader and the humble barrel maker, working together, had proven that even in the darkest hour order could be brought back. Suffering could be eased and human dignity could be defended. Bush Hill, the nightmare on the hill, had become under their unlikely command the first and most important battlefield where the city of Philadelphia began to win its war against the yellow fever. Dr. Benjamin Rush's faith in science, or at least in his version of science, was unshakable, and one of the bases of his plan to save Philadelphia was built on an observation, a widely held belief, and finally a tragic mistake. It was believed with the certainty of a written fact that people of African descent had a natural shield against yellow fever. Rush himself had read reports of epidemics in the South, particularly in Charleston, where it was seen that the enslaved population seemed to suffer the disease on a much smaller scale, if at all. So a doctor desperately looking for any edge, any firebreak in the middle of the firestorm, this idea was not just a medical curiosity. It was a gift from Providence, an answer. And so in early September, as the city emptied of its paler, richer citizens, Rush wrote an urgent appeal. He addressed it not to his medical friends nor to the city government, but to the leaders of Philadelphia's thriving free African-American community. He specifically reached out to two men of huge standing and character, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Both were former slaves who had bought their own freedom. Both were Methodist preachers and founders of the Free African Society, a mutual help group that was the organizational and spiritual heart of their community. Rush laid out his theory to them. He told them that God, in his endless wisdom, had made them safe from this particular plague, and therefore they had a moral duty, a sacred calling, to serve their sick and dying fellow citizens. Their help, Rush argued, would not only be an act of Christian charity, but would undeniably show the bravery and good character of people of color to the white community, helping to break the bases of prejudice and slavery. It was a powerful argument and mix of city duty, spiritual chance, and political advance. And Allen and Jones, along with the elders of the Free African Society, accepted it. They saw the truth in Rush's words, not out of pride, but from a deep sense of duty. They organized their community with an efficiency that put the city's falling government to shame. The black men and women of Philadelphia became the needed system that kept the city from collapsing completely. They volunteered as nurses, entering the homes from which everyone else ran. They tended to the sick, white and black alike, giving Rush's useless cures, changing sheets soaked with black vomit, offering words of comfort. In the final moments, they became the drivers of the death carts, making their way through the silent streets with the familiar call, "Bring out your dead." They did the most dangerous and unwanted work, transporting the bodies to the potter's field, and they dug the graves, hundreds of them. It was hard grind, as they would soon learn deadly work. At first the protection story seemed to hold. During the first weeks of September, as the makeshift hospitals filled and the newspaper death notices grew longer, the black community seemed remarkably untouched. It supported the belief, both in themselves and in the white community, that they were somehow special, protected. But then the cruel reality of virology, a science that did not yet exist, began to show itself. It happened quietly at first in those who had felt unwell, a cart driver who did not come to work. Then the whispers became a murmur, and the murmur a cry of alarm. They were getting sickened, they were dying. The betrayal was twofold. First, it was a biological betrayal. The supposed shield was a myth. It was true that some people who had grown up in regions of Africa or the Caribbean where yellow fever was common might have developed protection in childhood after a mild infection. But most of Philadelphia's African-American population had been born in America. They had no more inborn defense against the virus than their white neighbors. The disease did not see skin color. The Aedes aegypti mosquito fed without bias. And now, by willingly putting themselves at the center of the outbreak, in the sick rooms and on the death carts, the black community of Philadelphia had exposed itself to a huge dose of the virus. They became victims on a horrifying scale. Richard Allen would later describe the emptiness, watching his people fall like soldiers on the field of battle. He got the fever himself, surviving only through the care of his wife, while Absalom Jones by miracle never fell ill. But the second betrayal was perhaps more bitter, because it was a human betrayal. As black men and women were dying in the line of duty, a vile rumor began to spread as some of the wealthy Philadelphians who had run began to trickle back into a still sick city. They were met with bills for services given. Some caregivers, both white and black, undoubtedly took advantage of the desperation, charging very high prices. It was unavoidable in a crisis of such size, but the rumor, fed by hidden bias, focused almost only on the black helpers. They were accused of being profiteers, of forcing white families, in their hour of greatest need, of stealing things from the homes of the dead. This slander found its most powerful voice in a paper published soon after the epidemic faded. Its author was Martha Eucharia, a famous publisher and publicist who had served on the mayor's committee. His work, A Short Account of the Malignant Fever, became the most popular and accepted story of the plague, and in its pages Curry gave weight to the claims painting the black community not as heroes but as hunters. He wrote that prices were forced which, if asked on other times, would have shamed an Algerian pirate. It was a stab in the back, a rewriting of history that erased their sacrifice and replaced it with slander. The reply from Allen and Jones was fast and strong. Angry at the thanklessness and lie, they set to work on their own publication. In 1794 they published a narrative of the proceedings of the black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia. It was a passionate and carefully written defense of their community's actions. With quiet dignity and an accountant's exactness, they argued Carey's claims. They gave their own records, showing that most services were given for free, or for little pay. They pointed out that many of the black caregivers had spent their own money to buy medicine and food for their white patients. And most sadly, they listed the names of the fallen. They recorded the deaths inside their own community, 240 people, a death rate that by proportion was just as terrible as that of the white population. They proved with painful clarity that far from being safe and taking advantage, they had been weak and sacrificial. Their story was an act of self-taking back, an attempt to set the public record straight before the lie could harden into truth. But the damage had been done. The belief in a special shield was broken, and in its place the community that had stepped forward to save the city found itself defending against betrayal and prejudice. They had buried Philadelphia's dead, only to watch the city try to bury their honor. The month of October was a continuing hell, the peak of the plague. The machine of death was working at full power, and the only relief was tiredness. The city existed in a state of pause, of waiting for the sickness, waiting for death, waiting for the end. No one knew what the end would be. The doctors kept arguing. Rush kept bleeding and cleaning. Others suggested wine and chinchilla bark, and the people kept dying. The church bells, which had that first rung for every leaving soul, had been silenced by order of the mayor. Their constant ringing had become unbearable, and sound reminder of the size of the disaster. The silence that replaced them was in some ways worse. It was a thick, heavy silence broken only by the muffled crying behind closed windows and the rattle of the death cart wheels over the cobblestones. The people prayed They prayed for divine help for a miracle. But they also watched the sky and felt the air, holding on to an older wisdom. A folk wisdom that was whispered from house to house. It said that great epidemics, the rotten fevers, could not survive the cold. That the heavy still air of summer and fall was what held the bad air. The poison, but the clean sharp air of winter would clean it. So as October faded away, Philadelphia was not just waiting for God. It was waiting for a frost. The change came slowly, almost unseen at first. In late October the days, though often still sunny, lost some of their heavy edge. The nights began to hold a chill that had not been felt in months. People would wake and notice a slight mist of their breath. As they opened a window, it was a sign, a small promise. On October 28, Benjamin Rush noted in his journal that the temperature had dropped a lot and that the number of daily deaths seemed to be lessening for the first time in weeks. It went from over 100 a day to 80, then to 60. The city dared to breathe a little deeper. Then, in the second week of November, it came not as a dramatic storm, but silently in the dark of night. A mass of cold air swept down from Canada, cleaning the Delaware Valley. The temperature fell fast. Puddles of water in the streets, filled from the afternoon's earlier rain, froze at their edges. And in the morning, people who looked from their windows saw a world changed. A thin layer of white frost coated the roofs, the front steps, and the fallen leaves in the untended gardens. The first hard frost of fall had arrived. It was beautiful, a clear sugar coating on a rotting city. And it was to the people of Philadelphia the sound of the cavalry's horn, the sign that the war was ending. They did not understand the system, of course. They had no idea of the existence of a small striped mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, which had been the real enemy all along. They did not know that this insect, which bred in rainwater barrels, still ponds, and any container holding clean water, was the carrier that took the virus from person to person. They did not know that the cold did not clean the air, but simply killed off the adult mosquito population and stopped the growth of its eggs and larvae. The chain of passing, which had worked with brutal efficiency for 3 months, had been broken overnight. All they knew was that it worked. In the days that followed the frost, the drop in cases was drastic, almost miraculous. The Bushville Hospital, which had been hell on earth, suddenly had empty beds. The doctors, for the first time in months, were able to sleep through the night. The drivers of the death carts found their routes growing ever shorter. People began to open their windows not to air out sickness, but to let in the clean cold air they believed was their salvation. The relief that swept through the city was almost a physical force. It was real, a shared sigh that seemed to clear the cloud of fear that had hung over Philadelphia. People began to come out onto the street, blinking in the November sun, still careful, still eyeing their neighbors with a shadow of doubt, but coming out nonetheless. They would greet each other from a distance, a mix of joy and sadness in their eyes, each survivor recognizing another. The news of the frost and the plagues fading spread quickly to the nearby towns and farms where the refugees had been waiting, and they began to return. First it was a trickle, then a stream, and finally a flood. Carriages and wagons full of things rolled back into the city. On the Germantown and Derby roads, George Washington and his cabinet returned to the nation's capital. Congress prepared to meet again. Newspapers which had shrunk in size or stopped printing printed full papers once more. Shops reopened their shutters. The sound of hammers and saws began to be heard again, a counterpoint to the months of silence. Life, tough and strong, was returning to the streets of Philadelphia. The fever had not been beaten by medicine or by prayer. It had been defeated by the calendar, by the simple blessed arrival of the cold. The city had survived, but now in the cold light of day, with the immediate threat gone, the real work began. To look at the scars and count the dead. The return to life was a slow and painful process, like waking from a nightmare, only to find the sheets soaked in a real cold sweat. Those who returned to Philadelphia in November and December of 1793 found a city that was at once familiar and strangely foreign. It was their home, but a home that had been violated, a place haunted by the ghosts of what had just happened. The smell was the first thing many noticed, though the cold had softened. The smell of death and antiseptics or smell stayed in the air, a mix of the vinegar that had been burned in every house, the tar that had been lit on street corners, and the remains of gunpowder that had been fired in a useless attempt to clean the air. Then came the sights, the houses with a peep painted in lime on the door, for pestilence marking them as places of suffering, the windows that stayed closed not from fear of disease, but because there was no one left inside to open them, the overgrown gardens, the businesses with faded signs, announcing a short closing that had become permanent, and above all there were the gaps in families, in workshops, in the church seats. People were missing everywhere. The grim process of counting began. The Citizens Committee, which had run the city through the crisis, set about the job of making an official list of the victims. It was macabre detective work, involving the review of church burial records, reports from the death cart watchmen, and the words of survivors. The final number they reached was 4,044 recorded deaths between August 1 and November 9, but everyone knew the true toll was far higher. Many had been buried quickly in unmarked graves in backyards, or common pits with no one to write their names. Modern historians using population models guess the total number of dead was at least 5,000 and possibly more. 5,000 people in a city whose population, even before the leaving, was about 50,000. That meant 1 in every 10 people living in Philadelphia had died in the space of 100 days. If one thinks that nearly half the population ran, the death rate among those who stayed was shocking, close to 25%. It was killing on a scale the young nation had never seen. The bloodiest fight of the Revolutionary War looked small in comparison. The population scars were deep. The plague had taken young and old, rich and poor, but it had been especially cruel to the heads of households, the workers and laborers who kept the city's money running. It left behind hundreds of widows and nearly 400 orphans, who became the city's wards. The Masonic Lodge and other charity groups worked without rest to find them homes, but the social web was torn. Whole families had been wiped from the map, their family names gone. In a matter of weeks, the immigrant community, especially recent arrivals from St. Domingue, had been destroyed. The African-American community, as Allen and Jones wrote, had suffered terrible losses. Money-wise, the city was on its knees. Philadelphia was not just the political capital of the United States. It was its money and trade hub. The port, the lifeblood of its wealth, had been effectively closed. For 3 months ships did not come or go, trade stopped. Workers had died or run their shops silent. Farmers from the nearby countryside, afraid to enter the city, had stopped giving food. The money collapse was total. The recovery would take years. Philadelphia's name as America's healthiest and richest city was broken. Other cities like New York and Baltimore set strict quarantines on any ship or person coming from Philadelphia, treating it like a leper colony. But the deepest scars were in the mind. The epidemic had shown the fragility of civilization. It had dissolved the ties of community and, in many cases, even of family. Survivors were haunted by guilt, the guilt of having run, the guilt of having survived when others did not, the guilt of having closed it on a neighbor or family member in need. Trust had been broken. The shared experience had not brought people together in an embrace of unity, but had split them into islands of trauma and doubt. The city had looked into the abyss, and the sight of its own reflection in the darkness was not a good one. Yet from the ashes of this disaster something new rose. The plague of 1793 was a brutal wake-up call. It showed the deadly lacks of the city's system and the total absence of any kind of organized public health policy. People realized they could not depend on individual charity or make it up volunteer groups to deal with a crisis of this size. The government had a duty. In the years that followed, Philadelphia began a series of never-before-seen changes. It was seen that the city's water supply, taken largely from local and often dirty wells, was a danger. This led to the building of one of the nation's first city water systems, pumping cleaner water from the Schuylkill River. Steps were taken to improve cleanliness, pave more streets, and control the throwing away of waste. And most importantly, the city set up a permanent board of health, one of the first of its kind in America. This board was given the power to impose quarantines, manage hospitals, and take the needed steps to stop future outbreaks. It was the painful late birth of public health in America. The idea that an individual's health was closely tied to the health of the community and that protecting that shared health was an essential job of government. Yellow fever would return to Philadelphia in the years to come, but never with the same world-ending anger of 1793. The city had learned a terrible lesson, one written in the ink of black vomit, and paid for with 5,000 lives. The scar stayed a permanent reminder in the city's memory of that summer and fall when the sky fell. But those scars were also the map for a new path forward, a path toward a more modern understanding of disease society and shared duty. The great fire of the plague had cleared the ground, and from that burned earth, something new and stronger was beginning very slowly to grow. When the first hard frost of November finally came down on the Delaware Valley, it came not as a sign of winter, but as a release. The air, thick and foul for months with the smell of disease, death and vinegar, suddenly turned crisp and clean. The tired survivors of Philadelphia are coming out slowly from their sealed homes, blinking in a pale sun that cold was the signal that the monster yellow fever had at last gone back to sleep. The silence that had settled over the city was a creature of its own, dense and heavy, broken only by the distant hammering of a carpenter fixing a door or the lonely squeak of a wheelbarrow. The streets, once full of the life of a young and vibrant nation's capital, were strangely empty, covered with unswept fall leaves. Grass grew between the cobblestones. The windows of thousands of homes stared blankly like the eyes of a corpse. It was over, or more correctly, it had paused now, began the counting. Mayor Matthew Clarkson, whose figure had become a pillar of stability in the middle of the chaos, began the grim job of seeing the damage. The numbers were huge, of a population of some 50,000 people. An estimated 20,000 had run of the 30,000 who stayed. At least 5,000 were dead. 1 in 6 of those who remained in the city died. Whole families had gone erased from the records in a matter of weeks. Rich traders, skilled workers, dockhands, churchmen, doctors. The plague had made no distinctions. It was the great leveler. In the weeks that followed the frost, as the exiles carefully returned to their homes, often finding a shocking silence or the proof of a quick tragedy, a deep and uncomfortable looking inward began. The first story, that of city bravery and heroic sacrifice, was true, but it was not complete. Yes, men like Stephen Gerard and Peter Helm had taken charge of the Bush Hill Hospital, changing a pest house into a safe place by pure force of will. Yes, Dr. Benjamin Rush, though wrong in his methods, had worked himself to the point of collapse, pushed by an almost frenetic sense of duty. And yes, the Citizens Committee, organized by Clarkson himself, had managed to keep a semblance of order, giving out food, arranging for the burial of the dead, and caring for orphans. There had been moments of amazing humanity in the middle of the plague's inhumanity, but under this surface of heroism stirred a much darker, more sobering truth. The city's response as a whole had been a catastrophic failure. It had not been a response, but a series of sudden reactions. The government system had disappeared. Pennsylvania's governor, Thomas Mifflin, had run. The federal government, with George Washington at its head, had scattered. Most of the city's doctors had either died or escaped. The social system had fallen apart, leaving a space that only private charity and individual courage had tried to fill. And so, as the fall leaves fell on freshly dug graves, the autopsy began, not of a body, but of an entire city. The remaining leaders, Clarkson among them, gathered in cold sitting rooms, their talks shaded by the shared trauma. The question that hung in the air was relentless: how had this been allowed to happen, and what would be done to stop it from happening again? For no one was naive enough to think this was a single event. Ships would continue to come from the Caribbean, summers would continue to be hot and wet, the threat was permanent. Charity, they realized with a chilling clarity, was like a bucket of water thrown on a fire, a noble act, but basically useless against the inferno. Girardet's bravery at Bush Hill was admirable, but it was no replacement for a working hospital system. The Citizens Committee's efforts were good, but they were no replacement for an operating and authoritative city government. The make-it-up response made in the heat of battle had saved some lives, certainly, but it had let thousands more be lost. It had relied on the goodwill of a few, famously unreliable, a limited resource in a time of panic. What was needed was not more heroism, what was needed was structure. What was needed was foresight, what was needed was a permanent authority, with the legal power and money to act before a crisis exploded, not in the middle of it. The epidemic of 1793 had shown the basic fragility of 1700s city life. A city like Philadelphia was a complex and delicate organism, and its health depended on arteries and organs that it turned out barely existed. The belief that rose from the ashes of that fall was not simply that they must be better prepared. It was a far more deep realization. The health of the people, public health, was not a matter of individual charity or private morality. It was a basic duty of government. To protect citizens from a foreign attack was an accepted job of the state. To protect them from a microbial attack, unseen and far more deadly, must be one as well. This idea, so clear to us today, was then radical. It was the lesson written in 5,000 tombstones. The tragedy had forced the city to look at itself in a broken mirror, and the image it reflected was one of system neglect. The price of that neglect was counted in the unmarked graves, in what is now Washington Square, and the payment to stop future bankruptcies of human life would have to be the invention of something totally new, a permanent system made only to protect the life of the city. The winter of 1793-1794 was a time of sadness, but also of furious talk. The trauma was fresh. The fear of return was a real presence in every talk. This fear became the engine of political change. In April of 1790, pushed by Mayor Clarkson and a scared but determined people, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law that would forever change city rule in America. It made the Philadelphia a board of health. This was not another short committee for an emergency. This was a permanent government body, the first of its kind in the nation, given powers that would have been unthinkable just a year before. The Board of Health was a totally new creature. It had the power to impose quarantines, not just suggest them. It could stop ships, check cargo and cruise, and confine the sick and suspected to a chosen station far from the city's dense population center. It was given the power to say unclean public problems. Unclean slaughterhouses, foul-smelling tanneries, pools of still water, heaps of rotting garbage. They could enter private property to remove what they saw as a threat to the shared health. This showed an amazing growth of state power into the lives of citizens, a direct challenge to traditional ideas of the holiness of private property. For the memory of the death carts rattling through the silent streets was a more powerful argument than any paper on individual freedoms. A freedom to keep a yard full of filth ended where the risk of your neighbors dying of fever began. The new board's first and most visible project was the change of the quarantine system. The old station on Providence Island, downriver, had proven leaky and not effective. Something more strong was needed. A clean fortress. A new site was chosen in Tinicum Township, about 10 miles south of the city, at a place known as the Lazaret. Building began in 1799. It was no simple dock and shed. It was a purpose-built group. It had a main hospital for the confirmed sick, a quarantine building for healthy people from sick ships, and homes for the port doctor and staff. Ships coming from suspect ports, especially from the West Indies, during the summer months were required by law to stop there. A doctor would board check the list, question the captain, and check the crew and passengers. Any sign of sickness meant a required quarantine, sometimes for as long as 20 days. The Lazaret 2 was the new door to Philadelphia, a door with a biological lock. It was a physical statement that the city would no longer trust to luck or the honesty of ship captains for its survival. But quarantine was only one line of defense, a wall against outside threats. The 1793 epidemic, no matter its origins, had thrived in the inside conditions of the city itself. The bad air theory, the belief that disease came from bad airs coming from rotting matter, was still the main medical explanation. For supporters of this theory like Dr. Rush, the city itself was the patient. Its streets were arteries blocked with filth, its alleys cesspools of rot. The answer therefore was not just to keep disease out, but to clean the house from inside in. For that they needed a weapon. They needed water, a lot of water. Philadelphia, like most cities of the time, depended on individual wells and hand pumps. The water was often of bad quality, easily polluted by toilet pits and drains. There was no system for washing the streets beyond the occasional rain or the rare effort of a single citizen. The vision that rose was boldened on a scale never before seen in America. A city waterwork. The idea was to tap one of the city's great rivers, the Schuylkill, and use the wonder of modern technology, the steam engine, to pump water to a central holding tank from which it would be sent throughout the city by a network of underground pipes. The project was given to Benjamin Henry Lotrobe, a brilliant British architect and engineer who would become one of the key people in the building of the new republic. Lotrobe's plan was a masterpiece of the era's engineering. In 1799, work began on the Center Square waterwork. A neoclassical pump house was built on the banks of the Schuylkill, holding a huge steam engine. This engine pumped water through a brick tunnel to another, even finer pump house placed in Center Square, where Philadelphia's City Hall stands today. The second steam engine, held in a beautiful marble circle of Lotrobe's design, lifted the water into wooden tanks that it stopped from their gravity, did the rest, sending the water through miles of wooden pipes made from hollowed pine logs. The system went into use in 1801. It was a huge achievement. For the first time, the people of an American city had access to a relatively clean and reliable supply of running water. Fire plugs let firefighters fight fires more effectively, and most importantly, from a public health view, it gave the means to clean the city. Streets could be washed down, washing away the filth and waste thought to make the deadly bad airs. The Center Square system was expensive, likely to break, and served only a part of the city, but it was a revolutionary proof of idea. It showed that large public spending and technology could be used to reshape the city environment in the name of health. It was the direct forerunner of the magnificent Fairmount Waterworks, to be built a decade later, which would become a model for cities around the world. The search for clean water, born from the terror of yellow fever, had started a revolution in city systems. The Board of Health, the Lazaret 2 and the waterworks were not just separate projects, they were the connected pieces of a new idea of government, one in which the active protection of citizens' health was a central goal. The disaster in Philadelphia in 1793 was not a single event, whose results were limited to the banks of the Delaware. It was an explosion, and its shock waves went across the young republic, basically changing the relationship between citizens and their government. Philadelphia was not just any city, it was the nation's temporary capital, its straitened cultural heart, the light of its republican hopes. When the capital was brought to its knees, the rest of the country watched in horror, and as it began to pick itself up, they took notes. The most immediate legacy of 1793 was the spreading of the Philadelphia model. Other port cities, such as New York, Boston, Baltimore, and Charleston, became sharply aware of their own terrifying weakness. They were warrens of narrow streets, bad cleanliness, and crowded docks. each just one ship away from suffering Philadelphia's fate. Panic was a great mover by one these cities began to set up their own permanent boards of health, oft uncopied on the exact law example. The Philadelphia's quarantine stations were built at the entrances to their harbors. Little as or ATTOS to act as guards against brought-in disease. Talks began on the need for clean water systems and the control of city problems. The Philadelphia epidemic had made a city survival guide, and other cities were reading it with fervor. This process marked a turning point in the history of American federalism. Though public health grew mainly at the city and state level, the crisis of 1793 had shown that an epidemic in a major city was a threat to national security. It disturbed trade, paralyzed the government, and sowed panic. This led to the federal government's first step into health policy. In 1796, Congress passed the first federal quarantine act, which, though largely giving federal authorities the power to help enforce state quarantine rules, implicitly accepted that health was a matter of national concern. It was a small step, but it set a key example for federal involvement in public health crisis, a line that would eventually lead to the creation of bodies like the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Beyond the laws and the systems, the most deep legacy of 1793 was philosophical. The Enlightenment and the American Revolution had set the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The epidemic added a grim, real side to that promise. What good was liberty if one did not have the chance to live a life free from the constant threat of an early and horrifying death from a stoppable disease? The tragedy forced a generation of Americans to accept that Republican government had a duty not only to protect the political rights of its citizens but also their physical well-being. The health of the Republic, they realized, depended quite literally on the health of its Republicans. This new understanding was not accepted without fight. There were fierce debates over the cost of water systems, over the entry on personal freedoms posed by forced quarantines and clean checks. But the memory of the summer of 1793 was too powerful an argument. The image of a city left by its leaders where the dead were buried in mass graves by a handful of volunteers served as a constant reminder of the cost of inaction. The epidemic became the founding argument for public health in America. Every time a modern city cleans its streets, checks a restaurant, cleans its drinking water, or quarantines a traveler with an infectious disease, it is acting on the ideas made in the testing ground of Philadelphia. The tragedy of 1793 was not simply a story of death and despair. It was a trigger. It was the moment a society was forced to see that survival in a world of unseen threats required more than prayer and charity. It required science, however imperfect. It required engineering. It required paperwork, and above all it required the acceptance that the community is a body and that the sickness of one of its parts threatens the health of the whole. The 5,000 citizens of Philadelphia who died in that terrible fall did not know it, but their deaths brought a safer future for millions. Their suffering became the base upon which the building of American public health would be built, a silent but lasting legacy born of panic and made sacred in reason. And so the city and the nation learned a hard lesson that civilization is not just a matter of walls and trade, but also of drainage, clean water, and an organized defense against the indifference of nature.